Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me as always is Ken. How are you today, Ken?
I am well. I am delighted and humbled to be here as we look at our podcast statistics and see that we are way over the hump of over 2 million downloads. So grateful to you, our listener, and hopefully you'll be rewarded for checking in today with the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 204. We have 3 topics that we've specially prepared for you today, starting off with Counselling Foundations, where we visit the very building blocks of counselling. And today we're going to be looking at barriers in communication. What are the things that can come between us and a client in our practice? Then focus on self, where we recognise that we are the heart of our practice as practitioners. We look at applying the theory that we might learn or pick up through our arc of training, through our continuous professional development, and how that theory applies to ourself. And then in our final section for this episode, Practice Matters, where we dip our toe into practice and look at what may present in our therapy room. Rory met up with Chloe Swinton to speak about a really interesting topic. I loved this lecture, Rory. It's a lecture on ambiguous loss, so you want to be sticking around for that. Really, really interesting stuff. But starting us off, looking at those counselling foundations, we look at the barriers to communication. And this is an important part, I think, with something that you study when you're a student and you're on a course. You're going to do a module on barriers to communications. But I've also recognized, Rory, that barriers to communications are something that kind of overarch the whole of counselling practice, because as things change, we need to revisit these barriers to communication with the recent introduction of online, telephone counselling, digital ways of communicating. It brings other barriers up. But let's visit those foundations that are the barriers of communication.
Well, thank you, Ken. I mean, I think that, as you rightly say, counselling is all about communication. And it's about hearing the person in front of you and being very, very clear what they're saying. And also, when you respond to the person in front of you, them being very clear about what you're saying. And sometimes in school, it's called listening and responding. For those of us who have children, listening, responding is something that's taught in schools. But there are some real barriers to communication. And as someone who taught counselling for over a decade, you get a first-hand experience of what may be some of the biggest barriers. And one of them, surprisingly enough, is not listening.
Yes.
Not listening to what the person said. Many years ago, I remember teaching a class, and we did this wonderful exercise called This Is What I Think You Said, where one person for 1 minute speaks to someone else about something that's happened, and then the other person who sat quietly listening responds, paraphrases back. And I was observing one couple, this is a long time ago, and the person was saying that they'd had some road rage, they'd accidentally cut in front of someone's car and someone was waving the fist and it was very frightening. And the person was listening intently. And when it came to that person's time to respond, the person said, I think you need to probably do an advanced driving course. It was like,
bit of advice.
No, you've kind of missed it out there. You know, the words frightened, road rage.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. You could see the other person really kind of stepping back and not listening properly and not knowing how to respond, I think, is one of the biggest barriers.
Yeah.
And that is before we get into the other barriers, Ken. There's quite a lot of them.
Yeah. And when we're speaking about barriers to communication, what we're really saying is that when a client or someone is presenting and they're coming to us and they're bringing their content, they're bringing their material, they are communicating with us. And whether that is online, via email, in person, verbally, what is in the way? What is blocking what they are saying from reaching us, from landing, from us being able to use effective listening, being able to understand what they're bringing in? What is getting in the way? And you've just mentioned not actively listening. I mean, that is a big one. If you're not actively listening, there's a massive wedge in the way. What is being said is not going to get through to you. And when we look at barriers of communication, it's about looking to ourselves. There are certain external barriers, and I think we should start with an external barrier to communication, which I think is a pretty obvious one. If you're in a busy coffee shop where there's a lot of people around and there's clinking of plates and knives and forks, that could be a barrier of communication. It's called an environmental distraction. If you maybe have a counselling room where you meet with somebody and outside they're doing some road repairs and they've got the jackhammers out, or trucks driving up and down and making a lot of noise, that could be a barrier to communication. And that's maybe an obvious one that we would hear and go, oh, this is getting in the way with me being able to properly hear what you are saying. But there are some that are more subtle, aren't there, Rory? Some that may be unseen, specifically to the listener or the counsellor, where there are barriers, invisible barriers, that can distort what the client is bringing or cause that what the client brings not get heard or understood in its entirety.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And one of those invisible barriers could be something as simple as someone with a hearing difficulty.
Yes.
Really simple. Not for the person with a hearing difficulty, not being able to hear or not being able to hear at all. Someone who might rely on lip reading, or someone who might rely on signing. The two different ways within the deaf community. And I think it's really important that, if you're working with someone with a hearing impairment, that you kind of try to understand what is their preferred way of communicating, and something as simple as facing the person and speaking so they can read your lips.
Yep.
Not covering your mouth or not sitting at an angle that might be difficult, and maybe just asking them, can you understand me? I think that's a really good start, isn't it?
Yes.
Not presuming that because your lips are moving that it can be read, I think is a very good start.
Yes, and again, that is a barrier to communication that you may pick up on and then may be able to address, and maybe that the person would say, I can't hear you properly, or you may even say, you speak really softly and I can't hear you properly. And these can be addressed. And even more subtle are barriers that are unseen, such as a cultural barrier, where you have, and we need to recognize that our culture comes basically from, there's culture and there's heritage, which are different, but usually your heritage would kind of inform the culture you live in. And I look at my own culture, I look at how I grew up, I look at the family I grew up in, and the time that I grew up, the messages that were given to me by my primary caregivers, which was my mother and my father, what they told me was good, what they told me was bad, what they told me we do at certain times of year, what kind of holidays we celebrate, what kind of beliefs we hold. And these were given to me. I didn't choose them. They were given to me as I was growing up. It was told to me, this is how it is. And I need to recognize that is how I look at the world. I look through a cultural lens of who I am, how I was brought up, and that surrounded me. And we need to think, what does it look like when somebody comes in with a very different a different culture, different beliefs that they hold? They grew up in a different place, maybe a different country, maybe a different ethnicity, a completely different value system that they may have. If they are saying something, are we able to clearly hear it, or are we filtering it through our cultural lens? Because that is a barrier. They can say one thing and we can hear something else. And an example is something that I picked up on a television program. And I'm going to put the scenario out first, and then we'll evaluate the cultural ramifications of this. And the question is, or the challenge is, in your mind, listening to this now, if I was to tell you that there was a man and he was married, but he had to go away and he had to go and work away for just over a year. He went and he worked away for over a year, and then when he came back, he found that his wife had a child from a different partner. What does that bring up for you culturally from how you were brought up when you hear that story. Is that right? Is that wrong? Is that good? Is that bad? And you'll make a call or a judgment on that. And I certainly have my call or judgment on that. But I watched an interesting documentary about a tribe in Africa called the Himba tribe. And the Himba men will take the cows out to pasture and they'll be gone for more than a year. And it is common for them to come home and their wife, their chosen partner, lifelong partner, would have a child from another member of the tribe. And within their culture, this is embraced. This is embraced. This is how it is. They tribally bring up the children, and this is a regular thing. So culturally, if we were hearing that story from somebody telling us, would we be making a cultural judgment on that? Or because does that not create a barrier? They mean one thing, we might go, oh, that's terrible for you, and they could be, but no, that's not terrible. So there's an example of cultural difference.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think one of the biggest barriers to communication is actually the places where the listener can't go. And that might be something around sex or death or any of those kind of very profound human conditions. And you sometimes hear it in everyday conversations where someone brings up something that might be socially awkward and the person who's listening kind of changes the subject. Yes. Oh, have you seen that dog out there looking at that flower? Because you know that they can't go there. And I think it's probably more pronounced than we really think. Have a think about what would you not like to kind of engage with? What conversations don't you like to engage with? Could it be something around loss and bereavement? Some people just aren't very good talking about death. Some people find it very, very difficult to talk about sex or people's sexual proclivications. I think that's the right word.
Big words, Rory, big words.
Probably best to know how to pronounce them before you use them. And some people are very worried. I mean, I've had students who've said, oh, what happens if someone talks about, having an orgy? I'd feel very embarrassed about that. And I said, well, that's their choice. And you need to think about what's going on for you. You don't have to get involved in orgies. No one's suggesting that. But it might be, it might be worth you thinking about where does the embarrassment lie? What messages have you got about what constitutes, a healthy sexual life? And I think that is quite a big one. And also, faith and religion, I think, is one that people really, really, really try to shy away from. If you're working with someone who has a different faith position to you, you may be agnostic or have no belief at all. Are you going to audit yourself in case you say the wrong thing? And I think this is something that's coming up more and more in our society, where people we're becoming more diverse. It's not just religion; it's about sexuality, transgender issues, in terms of people identifying as something, and people just really worried about saying the wrong thing. So instead of getting involved in a dialogue and exploration, what happens is they say, well, I won't say anything, therefore I can't make any mistakes. And the person who's being listened to just doesn't feel validated or understood.
You can't be fully there with a person if you're running through checks and balances of should I say, I shouldn't say, I'm feeling this, but I've got to park that one side, and you're involving yourself in a process that is no longer active listening. You've got an internal dialogue going on. You're having a conversation with yourself rather than engaging as a listener to what the speaker is bringing. And I think that ties very nicely into where you started of saying not actively listening. And so many of these barriers to communication can kind of link back to that not actually listening. And then another area where there could be a barrier in communication is the use of jargon, the use of acronyms that might not be mutually understood. This comes, I guess, at a time where technology is changing all the time, and depending on your culture, and you can see how these all tie in together. You may have a person, let's say a young person that is very active on the internet, using new texting technologies, using shortened versions of words, LOL instead of laugh out loud, which would be used in a text. Are they mutually understood? Are we maybe using jargon? that might not be understood by the speaker. So we're feeding something back and using a little bit of jargon that is not fully understood. Am I giving them the UPR? Well, what is UPR? Well, if you studied counselling, UPR is unconditional positive regard. But if you walk up to a person in a coffee bar and say, what do you think of UPR? There is an instant barrier to communication. So thinking about jargon, and it goes both ways. The barrier to communication is not just about you as the listener or as the counsellor. It's looking at both sides of the relationship. The barrier can come from either side. And I think this discussion is about recognizing that there are barriers that come into communication, being open to looking out for barriers that may come up in communication and thinking about how you might work if you recognize a barrier. Because we can't ignore it or go, well, I'm not going to feel that way when it comes up for me. It's about recognizing and going, okay, I see here is a barrier. How am I going to work with that? FOMO. You don't want to have any FOMO, Rory.
Oh,
no, you don't want. Now,
No.
FOMO, what is FOMO? Is it a soft, squishy cushion? No.
Is it a drink?
Is it a drink?
Soft drink.
A delicious drink. It is fear of missing out. But here again, it's a shortened version of a word that might be used in text, or it's actually used quite a lot lately. I've heard it being used a lot. They tend to go in trends, but it's a use of jargon, which can be a barrier to communication, Rory.
Absolutely, and one big barrier can be class,
Yes.
and the language that attaches itself to class. I remember many years ago sitting in my certificate class, and the external moderator came in to ask some questions. So what happens usually at the end of a course, the external moderator comes in and has a chat with the students to make sure they're happy with the course and, all is good. And I remember this person sat at the end and she said, I'm sure that you're all getting involved in lots of autodidactic activities. And everybody just stared at each other. And fortunately, and I'm not sort of bigging myself up here, I knew actually what that meant, but I would say that 90% of the class had absolutely no idea. And I just said to the moderator, I said, I wonder if you could explain what that meant, because I'm not really sure. I actually told a bit of a lie for the greater good. And she said, self-learning. And I think that what happens is and I found out myself, as you become more educated, you take on the language of education and it kind of seeps out into your everyday conversations. Yeah. And sometimes you can leave people behind them. And more importantly, you can make people feel less than, because it's almost like they're not in this clique. They're not in this discussion. But it also goes the other way. I can remember one of my students said, I've got a client who said that everything's bobbins. I have no idea what that meant. Well, I actually sitting in a former mill town. If I look out the window, I can see what's left of the mills and that part of the Industrial Revolution here in the UK. And bobbins means not very good. It's a term that kind of gets into the dialects of people who live in the north of England, especially around mill towns, where they say it's bobbins and it means it's not very good. And in fact, if you go just slightly up the road to Bury, you might hear someone say it's bangers, which again is another kind of colloquialism for it's not very good. So it can go both ways. But when we fall into that use of jargon or colloquial language, it can certainly cause a bit of confusion.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You led into that to speaking about class and socio-economic class, where you live, how you grew up. It can influence how you see the world, the language that you use. You're speaking about slang there, or use of jargon that can come from a cultural base. And when you look at these barriers to communication, so many of them kind of just knit together so well. And I think you've just painted that really beautifully there, Rory. That's bob on, that is, the way that you've...
It's a Bobby Dazzler.
It's a Bobby Dazzler. So we're now... And if you're listening to this and you go, well, I don't know why they're giggling at Bobby Dazzler, because I don't know what they're talking about. There it is. You can see how that barrier comes in. And now, if you live in the UK and you are of a certain age and you watch certain television programs, then Bobby Dazzler, you would realize it means something that is really good. It's kind of really good. That's what Bobby Dazzler means. But it is a use of slang. It may be cultural, and it creates a gap. It creates a slight misunderstanding of what's being given. And so often, maybe the speaker or the client wouldn't have courage to do what you did, Rory, and go, I wonder what you meant there. Because you can sometimes feel foolish by asking a question. So they may just go, okay, but there's a gap. There's a little bit of a gap, and that's what we're talking about with barriers to communication, where the understanding breaks, and it can lead to a degradation of the relationship. And counselling or active listening and using counselling skills is all based on that relationship. We want to strengthen that relationship. We want to create equality. And these barriers to communication are things that kind of come in the way. And I think we'd be remiss, Rory, if we didn't speak about the technology gap, specifically with how things have moved, specifically in counselling and psychotherapy. With the use of technology has been something that has been pretty prevalent in counselling and psychotherapy. However, with the recent pandemic that is now hopefully behind us, or the worst of it at least, it changed things because people were cut off. Many people needed to turn to technologies in order to communicate. But there can be a great gap there, a barrier of, can a person use that technology? Do they know how to work their way around that technology? What kind of feelings does it bring up when they engage with that technology? Do they not like it? Does it kind of bring anxiety up? And I remember when I first got a computer, it would cause me incredible anxiety doing the simple things. People would say, all you need to do is click here and do that and do the next thing. And click on the menu, and I was thinking, what is a menu? What's a menu? Open a browser. What's a browser? Go to your browser tab. What's a tab? And I was missing the jargon, and I was working with technology, and it created anxiety for me. Technology can be a gap, and we need to recognize that technological gap that can come in, not even if you're using the technology, even if you're just discussing it in a face-to-face and you might be using words, again, jargon, that relate to the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that technology has been really, really good at through the years, and tech companies, is giving us a standard form of language. You know, if you think of anything you buy nowadays, all the buttons are standardized, whether you buy a computer or a television. All, on and off is a universal symbol now. And I think that when we use technology, we sometimes probably don't know how much we know. And I think if you're working online, it's really good to do that old teacher's trick of trying to find out what knowledge someone's got and use that as a starting base. But you're right. And also, I think that one of the areas to really keep an eye on is choosing the modality you use or the method of communication you use when you decide to do online and telephone counselling. I particularly wouldn't be any good at all at text or email therapy by the fact I'm dyslexic.
Yeah.
I'm not good at literation. I think that's the word for it. That's a word I do know. Literation.
Well, I've just learnt it. Thanks, Rory.
I think no letters, please. And I wouldn't engage in email therapy because I just don't have that capacity to write. I know lots of people who write beautifully and can really express emotion and context. It's something that escapes me. I hope I can speak it better than I can write it. I guess only you, the listener, will know that. So I wouldn't choose to write. And there may be some people who would prefer to write rather than communicate over the internet. So I think if you're thinking about, how you're going to communicate, maybe worth having to think about where your strengths are, do a strengths-based kind of analysis, and also thinking about, how you're going to transmit that to your client. If a client approached me and said, well, we want to do text, then it'd be, well, thank you for thinking of me, but it's not an area that I use. I don't think I'd work well with that. But I can refer you on to someone who probably be able to give you a lot of help.
Yeah, and I mean that is in service of the client, really, because and in service of yourself, because it's not your chosen medium. But if you were to engage in, let's say, email, and you were to maybe make grammatical errors or spelling errors due to your dyslexia, that could be a barrier for the person reading it. Oh, he doesn't even care enough to spell the words right or to use the right grammar. It could become a barrier to communication. So you're recognizing that for you is a barrier, and you're making a choice of how you practice based on that. And I think that's the takeaway here. That's what this is all about. Look at your position as a active listener or in a helping profession wherever you work, or as a counselor, and look at your culture, look at your slang that you might use, look at the barriers that may come up in your interactions with others, and plan for it. You know, if we're asking these questions, then we're putting the work in beforehand, and that's always the best place to put it in. I think there's a Chinese proverb, I may be quoting this wrong, saying, when is the best time to plant a tree? And the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. It is. It just is. But if you didn't plant that tree 20 years ago, the second best time to plant a tree is now. And the same is true. You know, when you're talking about these barriers to communication, the best time to look at them is way before you're in the interaction with the person. And that's why we have these conversations in service of the clients that may come to us, bring us their materials one day. So we encourage you to have that debate, speak to colleagues, journal about it, have a think about the barriers to communication that may come up in your relationships. Thank you for bringing that topic, Rory, and we move now on to our focus on self. This is now where we recognize that you are the center, the heart of your practice, and today we're looking at applying theory to self. This is an exciting one, I think, Rory.
It is, and I want to start off with a little kind of domestic story from Counselling Towers. Mrs. Counselling Tutor and myself sat down for our evening meal, and my wife doesn't mind being called Mrs. Counselling Tutor. She likes the anonymity of it, so no letters, please. And she said, you know, Rory, she said, I think I had some transference today, and she went on to explain how she was kind of slightly miffed with somebody, and then realised that this person reminded her of someone from her past who she really was miffed with or upset with. That's a northern term, miffed, upset with. And it was very useful that through the years, my wife isn't a therapist, but through the years, she's picked up stuff from myself. You know, we've talked about theories, and it helped her kind of see this person as a new person in her life and not someone from the past, and also helped her to balance out her communication and manage her anxiety around this person. And I think it speaks to applying theory to self. And I don't know about you, Ken, but no one gave me an emotional instruction book. I didn't get to sort of 18, and my parents said, there we go, there's this big book, Rory, called The Book of Rory, and this is why you feel like you do, and you can go through and, you know, you feel upset, so you just look at you in the the index, you're upset. And no, it doesn't work that way. And it was only when I went to study counselling that I realised that part of the theory, apart from helping others, is also about understanding your own process. And there were some real light bulb moments. And, you know, people who regularly listen to the podcast know I'm a person-centered therapist, predominantly person-centered. But actually, I learned a lot from things like transactional analysis, the parent, the adult, and the child, and also a lot from CBT about irrational thoughts and awfulizing things. And it really did change who I was, because I now had a vocabulary and an understanding of why I was feeling like I did, and also being able to manage it. Because I think part of it is managing sometimes, you know, if we have disappointments in life, or we're feeling a little bit vulnerable, by being able to link it to theory, it gives us an idea of, you know, why that's happening, and more to the point, how we can stabilize ourselves, keep us in the adult, Ken.
Yeah, there's comfort in the theory, and So you mentioned, Rory, automatic thoughts, like when you're looking at the behavioral models and understanding the theory or hearing the theory can take a person from a position of, you know what, I don't want to tell anybody about this because I think people will think I'm absolutely insane, to others also experience this. And one example of that is you're driving your car down the road and suddenly this thought pops in your mind, wonder what would happen if I just now swerved onto the other side of the road and just crashed into the oncoming car. You're not going to do it, but it's, you can leave yourself thinking, what the hell is that? What's going on? Am I insane? I should not be having thoughts like this. And then you look at irrational thoughts, automatic thoughts, and you see, okay, hold on, this is common. Other people have it as well. I'm not mad. It's part of the human condition. And there it is. It's part of the human condition. Now, as people, we are all unique. We are all different. We all bring a different perspective to the world. Yet there are similarities. And if you look to the human psychology, the science of psychology that underpins who we are, we have certain ways of working and operating as humans, and they can be similar in many, many instances. And there are experiments that kind of evidence this. Research is done, and the outcomes of those research then turns into theories which are taught. And it is on these theories that we base our practice and what we do in service of our clients. And understanding those theories leads to an understanding of self. Yes, we go in service of our clients to learn this so that they come and that we're able to work with what they're bringing. But there is the element of us working on ourselves. The unexamined life is not worth living. Taking a little bit of theory, going, ooh, I like that, and looking at how it relates to you, how it relates to your life. I love it. I loved learning the theories. Some of them kind of shook my world a bit, going back to the early days, learning about person-centered theory, introjected values, conditions of worth, where you're kind of working to the values that other people have set, not your own internal values. I was going, wow, examining my life. What are my introjected values? To which conditions of worth do I work? And I think that there's self-development in taking the theory and playing with it. And I love doing CPD. Our next section in Practice Matters is Chloe Swinton speaking about ambiguous loss. And watching the lecture on ambiguous loss, I was able to pause afterwards and think, how can I be in better service to clients? But also I was thinking, wow, how does this relate to me? Where are the areas of my life where I can recognize this theory? And I think there's solace in that. There's certainly learning in it, and there's certainly personal development in it. But the theories are kind of universal. And what's interesting is if you've been around long enough in counselling and psychotherapy, and you look at TA and you look at CBT and you look at person-centered and you look at Gestalt, you might start finding similarities in the theories, just with different names. Yes, they're different. Of course they are. And the studies were different. The evidence that underpins it is different. But there's similarities there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. It does speak to personal development. And I think one of the interesting things is that not only can you help yourself, but by helping yourself, you can help others. And I think one of the key things that I've observed throughout the years of watching students learn and grow is that those who take the theory on for themselves and are able to introject it, to use a bit of theory, to absorb it, are better at being able to help others because they're more empathic. They understand where somebody's coming from when it comes to maybe an introjected value, condition of worth, where somebody's living to someone else's rules, where, and this usually happens with children, they grow up in a household with the parents' view of the world, and then they go to school, and then they go into the wider life, and they develop their own views. And then parents and the older generation can say, oh, the children of today, and, which is something that goes back to, antiquity, really, thousands and thousands of years, older people have been going, the children of today. And that's because they're seeing the world as they're engaging with it. And their view of the world is how they're seeing it, and they're developing their views of it by that. They're not taking external views, they're developing them. And we can see that young people, are the people who change the world. But one of the interesting things that I think about applying theory to self is that you're better able to regulate your emotions, generally speaking, because you know what the hell's going on with you.
Yes.
You know what the hell is going on with you. Like Mrs. Counselling Tutor, who said, I could have really not had a good relationship with this person because there was an inherent dislike of them for no reason. There actually was a reason. She could say it's transference. It reminded me of someone in my past. That's not the same person. I'm going to evolve and alter my behavior. I'm going to manage that behavior. And the only person who can alter yourself is you. And I think theories are a great way of helping that personal development, personal growth, and affect change.
It's empowering, and in episode 203 of the Counselling Tutor podcast. You can go and find that by going to Counselling Tutor, clicking on the podcast tab, and you'll see all of our past episodes there. We spoke about attachment theory in this very section in Focus on Self and identifying your own attachment style. And there again, all we're talking about here is a bit of theory. And I want to use a story, Rory, if I may. When I was in school, I really struggled with maths. And specifically when we got to the theorems of maths, where you had to learn off by heart a theorem, a set of numbers, that when you get a question like this, you put it into this theorem and it's all going to work out. And there was this theorem that I had to learn. And I remember asking the teacher, I said, but why? Why do you put it like this? And the answer was, it doesn't matter. You just do. So just learn it and you'll be able to apply the knowledge in the exams. And that was not satisfying for me at all. And I didn't get it. And I still don't get it because it wasn't explained to me. And when you have a theory that is not applied, it doesn't mean anything. It's just words on a paper. Somebody saying, when somebody does this, then it's like this. But as soon as you are able to apply it to your own life, it breathes life into the theory. It goes from being a theory to being a moment. And Rory and I taught alongside each other for a number of years, and so often students would hear a theory and then say, the penny has just dropped. I've just had one of those moments where it now makes total sense. Using ourself as the barometer for the theory is empowering. It really is. And it breathes life into what is essentially words, scientific research and words on a piece of paper. When applied to ourselves, we get more of an understanding. And I like how you said it, Rory. It gives us the power to be much more empathic when we see it in a client.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I forget, this topic is one that comes up time and time again in our Facebook group. It's one that's repeated over and over. If you look in our Facebook group, you'll see it's a perennial. It always blossoms at certain times of the year when people are doing personal development assignments. They're talking about applying the theory to themselves. And if you want to become a member of our Facebook group, it's easy. Open Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door and our friendly moderation team will let you in, and you can join thousands of like-minded people in the world of counselling and psychotherapy, students, qualified colleagues, supervisors, and a smattering, a soup song of tutors who will all be very friendly. And, if you've got any questions, we'll try and help you answer them. But it's absolutely correct what you say. You can take control of your lives. And I think there's no more powerful agent of that than when you're working with clients who say, I've been assaulted or I've been raped, and why didn't I run away? Why didn't I scream out? And you use a neurological theory and you say, well, because your brain was protecting you and it was doing its best to keep you safe. And when you explain that neurological theory, the fight flight theory, people are liberated. It's no longer their fault. It's no longer a failing. They understand it's a neurological response, and the relief and the tears and the years of blame lifted off people's shoulders just about explaining and sharing a theory is absolutely incredible. And we saw that in counselling classes, people shedding burdens they've carried for so long. You started off with talking about, Ken, irrational thoughts. And I used to, when I did the CBT modules, I used to talk about running people over at bus stops. Not that I'd run people over at bus stops.
Oh, the letter bag is filling up as we speak.
I can just see it now. My email box will be pinging. And I used to say, I go home sometimes and, people stop bus stops. And I used to think, what would happen if I ran over them? And people used to go, And the first time I did it, I thought, I'm in trouble now. And then I realized it was that people thought that themselves.
Yeah.
And the very fact that I said, and that's just the nature of ants, automatic negative thoughts, as they say in CBT, that people released years of thinking that they were psychopaths and that they somehow were bad people. I said, these are just ordinary thoughts that everybody has. And it might be that you, the listener, has been released from that. You might be hearing that for the first time in this podcast and go, so that's just what human beings are like. And if that's the case, then, that's a great thing, isn't it, Ken?
It is. And I think as we kind of come to the end of this topic, the applying theory to self, yes, we get the theory from our base modality, from your core training when you were a student, and maybe many light bulb moments. But it's CPD that continues that. And as we do our CPD, maybe the challenge here is to change the mindset from, okay, I do this CPD so that I can serve my client, so that I can claim my CPD hours. What can I do to work with my clients better? And to kind of just keep that part of us open to, how does this apply to me? Where is the theory that I can apply to self? Some journaling time to kind of work with that. It just enriches the journey. And often by professional bodies, we're asked when we do CPD to say how that we might apply that learning in our practice. But I think just that extra little question, how does this theory apply to me in my life? Because at the end of the day, focus on self is a section, because we recognize that without us within our practice, there is no practice. We are there. We are the heart of our practice. And that focus on self, so important. And applying theory to self, really, really rich learning, personal development in service of our clients. It just ticks all of those boxes.
Yes, it nourishes the soul, Ken.
Oh, I like that. I like that. So as we move away from nourishing our soul, we're speaking about CPD. Here is certainly somewhere where you can get some theory that you can apply to self. We go into practice matters. Rory, you met up with Chloe Swinton speaking about ambiguous loss.
Well, through the years, there's been lots of theories of loss, and one of the most popular ones is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's theory of loss. However, we're beginning to be and developing a better understanding of loss. And I caught up with Chloe Swinton, who talked about ambiguous loss, this hard to place feeling of loss that sometimes carries through people. And she produced a fantastic lecture for us. And I interviewed her on the lecture, and this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
And we welcome Chloe Swinton, who's done a fabulous lecture for the Counsellor CPD Library and the Counsellor Study Resource Library on ambiguous loss. So, Chloe, you're very welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I'd never come across the term ambiguous loss until I came across your work. And on investigation, it's something that's kind of got a growing edge to it, hasn't it?
It's actually something we all experience, but it's not a term that we've heard of. So I'm not surprised you've not heard of it, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. So everybody experiences it at some time in their life, do they?
Yeah, and it depends to what degree that affects someone, and a lot of other factors around them to how they feel supported with that.
Yeah. So I guess by ambiguous, when I think of the term ambiguous, I think of something that you can't quite put your finger on, that it's a little bit kind of, there's something I'm not quite right, or as we say in my part of the world, I'm out of sorts, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Would that be a summing up of ambiguous loss?
Yes. So the dictionary definition of ambiguous is not clearly stated or defined, and loss, as we know, is the state of no longer having something or as much of something. But there's actually two different types of ambiguous loss that Pauline Boss, who coined the term in America in the 1970s, talks about. So there's type 1, which is psychological absence with physical presence. So if you think of the situation of someone with dementia, someone with addiction, or perhaps a chronic illness. And then there's the other side, which is the physical absence, but the psychological presence. So that is, for example, missing people, divorce, or adoption as examples.
Yes. So someone who's maybe, a child of a divorced couple may feel ambiguous loss for their parent. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's right. So in most cases, it's grieving someone alive who is missing in mind or body. So you can think about it in that way. It's usually a bit easier to kind of process. But yeah, you're totally right. They're kind of there, but not there.
Yeah. So they may not actually be dead, but they're alive. But because you're not seeing them, you're still feeling that loss because you haven't got contact with them.
That's right. Yeah. And it can actually it's being described as the most stressful type of loss, often without closure or a goodbye. So, and it can go on and on and on. So, for example, someone with dementia, how long does that go on for before perhaps a final goodbye? Or someone who's missing, how long is it before they return home, or perhaps otherwise? So it's quite complicated, really.
I was going to say that it does really fall under the heading of complicated grief, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's talking about grief, it's actually very interesting because there's the terms that people would most identify with is anticipatory grief, which is kind of experienced when a death or a loss might be imminent. So it happens long before the person dies or goes missing or whatever the situation is. There's frozen grief. So that's when our grief becomes frozen or delayed. And our brains kind of freeze as a way of coping. And there's disenfranchised grief as well, which Kenneth Doka says it cannot be openly acknowledged, socially validated or publicly supported. So it's often minimalized or invalidated by others, and it prevents us from mourning the loss. So it's actually a very interesting area when we start looking at grief.
Yes, it seems to me that grief is more layered and more granular than perhaps initially people thought. I was doing some research on this, and I got the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, that people who've been deposed or deported from countries or have lost their homelands can feel ambiguous loss. Would that be true? That's
right. Yeah, it can be. So that might be through immigration or emigration. It might be through being displaced, through natural disasters or, catastrophic tragedies, all sorts of things. Yeah. That's right.
So how would we know if someone was experiencing ambiguous loss? If we had a client, what would be the telltale signs that there may be ambiguous loss going on for this person?
Yeah, well, it would obviously be through their situation, because ambiguous loss it's actually something that happens outside of the person and their situation or their circumstances. It's caused by external factors. It's a relational issue, so it's not an individual pathology, but the person might show increased stress or ambivalence. They might have trouble making decisions over a long period of time. They may lack hope and meaning. It's very common to have a lot of conflict in families or problems with identity and roles. Who am I now? And amongst all this kind of chaos and this ambiguous loss. They might isolate themselves, or they might feel very stuck. So there's lots of things that kind of come up, which can also be as a result of, many other factors too, around, depression or trauma or whatever else is going on for someone. So there might be things that they say around not accepting or understanding what's happened with regards to their loss, might be indicators.
Yes, and at the time making this podcast, of course, people fleeing persecution from different countries, and people looking for sanctuary in different countries. It may be that those who are counselling those individuals for trauma and a lot of other issues that come up when we have mass movements of people because they're being persecuted, ambiguous loss may be in that mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one thing that we've all been through is the pandemic. And there's been an increase of inquiries during the pandemic, because I think people can relate to, lots of losses of plans and jobs and freedom and dreams and, education and travel and health. But most commonly with ambiguous loss, it's been someone in the early lockdowns of not being able to visit someone who was perhaps dying in hospital or struggling with their health, not being able to have a funeral, not being able to say goodbye, and no community support in those times too. Was very restricted, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and of course, sadly, people died in the pandemic. People in care homes couldn't be seen by their loved ones, and they had to see them at a distance. It seems to me it's an idea of our time, and one that has become sharp focus, as you say, with the pandemic and what's going on in the world. I wonder what you hope people will learn from your lecture. What would you hope that people took away when they'd finished, and how and applied it to their practice?
Yeah, so one of the things that I introduce in the lecture is a model that I've worked with over 15 years, developed in 2016. And I give some ideas around how to support a client going through ambiguous loss. And the main goal is to learn to live well with uncertainty, kind of increasing tolerance and being able to live with unanswered questions, which to a degree is very difficult for all of us. So I go through the model and I explain some of the kind of, give some kind of guidelines on what can help explore, what a counsellor can explore with a client, to help them through that process. Yeah,
so it's a very existential kind of engagement, and maybe questions that aren't answered, and things that can't be resolved, but trying to make some kind of peace with it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, it's been fascinating. I'm sure that the lecture is going to be absolutely fascinating. As I said, I do believe it is an idea of our times, and I think it's an idea and a theory that we're going to be engaging with in our practice rooms a lot, with the world as it is. So Chloe Swinton, thank you very much.
Big thank you to Chloe Swinton and to you, Rory, for hosting that interview, to bring us that information. Big takeaway for me, when we speak about loss, there's usually an ending of something, an actual, okay, that's finished now and I need to move past it. And many of the theories of loss deal with that. There's an ending and I now need to kind of move on. But ambiguous loss, there's that grey area where it might not be the ending. And an example I think about is my dog runs away. Is the dog going to come back? Is the dog okay? It's a different kind of loss. The dog is still not there. When somebody maybe has a stroke and part of them is not there, they're still there, but they're not there. It just brings a new perspective. I think a really important topic, a really interesting topic, certainly something we can look out for in our practice. And if you're interested in hearing the entire lecture, Chloe Swinton's lecture on ambiguous loss, it is available in the Counsellor CPD library. If you're a member, log in. That lecture has been uploaded for you. If you're not a member of the Counsellor CPD library, you can get information by going to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is right there for you. This has been episode 204 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off with Counselling Foundations, barriers to communication, how we may audit ourselves or not be completely communicative or hear the other person, what those are and how we may get around them. And then focus on self. We talked about how we apply theories to ourselves and how those might enlighten us and make us become more empathic and better understanding to others. And then finally, we caught up with Chloe Swinton, who talked about ambiguous loss, a fantastic lecture, and really a brand new and developing theory in the world of loss. Very, very useful and certainly in service of clients. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.